Welcome to the Jersey Justice Podcast, featuring your hosts, attorneys Gerald Clark and Mark Morris.
Justice Albin, thanks for coming here today. Also, I just want to thank you for your many years of public service, starting as an assistant prosecutor, but then with the New Jersey Supreme Court, and it's been a long, storied career, so I thank you for that.
Thank you.
And I'm super psyched that you're here today, and you're a high-profile guest. I really appreciate you being on the show, and I'm really hoping I don't screw it up here today. So just bear with me, because I'm sure I will screw it up.
That goes both ways.
Yeah.
Hopefully you'll prevent me from going off the rails.
No, I'll be in the same spot, Justice. I'm a little starstruck.
Yeah, when you came here today, all the staff and everyone was giddy. I was giddy. I'm still giddy about it. So again, I super appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
So can you want to just tell us a little bit about, people can Google you and they can find it out, but for our thing today, could you just tell us where you grew up, kind of where you went to school and grammar school and high school, and kind of how it kind of led you along to your career path a little bit?
Sure. So I was born in 1952. I lived in Bayside, Queens for the first 16 years of my life. My family lived in a garden apartment complex for the first 10 years. I lived in a part of Queens where there were a lot of parks, there were a lot of bike paths, and it was a regular sort of Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer type of childhood. Very happy one. I went to PS 188 and PS 203 elementary school. I went to Marie Curie Junior High School. In New York, junior high school is 7th, 8th, and 9th grades. And then at the age of 16, I went to Cardozo High School for my sophomore year. It had just been built, named after the renowned jurist, Cardozo. And then my folks had their we were renting a two-family house. The rent was jacked up 100%. My mother and father decided to purchase their first home, which was in Sayreville, New Jersey. So the house wasn't built yet. I went to live with my aunt and uncle in Canarsie, Brooklyn. That was in the fall of 1968. And then landed in New Jersey, in Sayreville, about December of 1968. So the 1968 was a really formative year for me. Even at the age of 8 years old, I was really keyed into the Kennedy-Nixon election campaign. I don't know why I was a Kennedy fan, but I was. So I followed that very closely as a young, as a kid, as a youth, and I sort of idolized Kennedy, and it was a really interesting period, much different from the one we have here. All of my friends' parents, my own parent and my own father, had served in the Second World War. It was a time of high patriotism, and when you think of Kennedy's call to public service, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. That very much animated the spirit of the country at the time, and certainly had a great effect on me. It was a time of cultural ferment. There was the civil rights movement. I was very aware of public events because my father was a pressman for the New York Times. And when he would return home with the New York Times and every other daily newspaper. So I became a newspaper junkie at a very young age and very keyed into public events. So the 1960s was a period of great turmoil, civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, protests.
Let me ask you a question. How do you compare the turmoil of today with the 68? One thing, hey Oscar, can you just turn the air, just for the noise part? I was at someone's house a while ago, and it was this like really nice house, and they had all these books, and one of the books they had was like a lot of America's original writings, and basically I think the guy he had this summer house, which is bigger than probably most people's regular houses, and was at this party, and I'm like, where'd you get all these books? And he goes, oh, we have a decorator come in, and then the decorator comes in, decorates the house, and will also order the library. And he had, and so there's this thing called, I think it's the Library of America. And what they do is they're dedicated to preserving all of America's original writings. And from that, I started ordering some books, and I got like a lot of Washington's writings, and I got all the original writings from the Civil War, like letters from soldiers home, key addresses from leaders and that kind of thing. And also, I got the book on the War of 1812. And when I see what's going on in the last, I don't know, call it 8 years, maybe 10 years, maybe 5 years, and kind of a lot of the dissension and the high temperature in the country, and I compare it to some of those original writings in America, this is nothing compared to what it was. Back, when Hamilton dueled with
Aaron Burr.
Aaron Burr, there you go. And it gave me some solace to read those original writings and compare it to what's going on today. Because what's going on today, I think, can stress people out. It certainly stresses me out. And when I read those original writings and compared it to what's going on today, I'm like, we're okay. This is fine. We're going to get through this. This is nothing what it was. So that's a long-winded way of asking you, like the turmoil of the 60s, and the riots and all that stuff. How does that compare in your mind to what's been going on lately here?
It's different in kind, but it's what was going on in the 1960s, I thought, would, in a short period of time, basically be cured and people would come together. There wasn't this sort of political division in the country then. You had liberal Republicans, you had very conservative Republicans.
That Kent State thing. Kent
Right.
State was where the officers fired on college students, right?
Yes, May 4th, 1970.
I mean, we haven't had anything like that recently. I mean, certainly
No.
there's individual situations, but you've never had cops fire on protesters in America since
No,
then.
they weren't cops. They were actually the National Guard, were called out in Ohio.
Yeah.
Things got totally out of control. But they were major protests in the 1960s. Hundreds of thousands of people coming out onto the streets in Washington, protesting the Vietnam War. And remember, it wasn't a different time. We didn't have a volunteer army. Okay, young people were conscripted. Okay, so their parents and they had skin in the game. And once the American public started turning against the war in Vietnam and saying that was leading nowhere, the United States government was propping up a corrupt South Vietnamese government, widespread dissension spread throughout the country.
One thing I learned about that, though, I majored in political science, and I've always kind of been drawn to political science, politics, policy, that kind of thing. It interests me. Never really that good at math, which is probably the same for a lot of lawyers. But one thing I learned, so I think most people would agree that Vietnam was a terrible tragedy. It was a terrible situation, all that stuff. But one thing a college professor, a point that he made to us as a class about the Vietnam conflict, was that it showed the Soviet Union, if that's how they're going to fight for that little piece of territory and to prevent communism there, we better watch out. And one point the professor was making was that, the Vietnam War had a big deterrence effect on Russia. Even though the war turned out the way it did, it sent a signal to the Soviet Union that these guys are all in and they're going to fight us everything. But anyway, I don't know what that.
I don't buy that at all. It's the first time I've ever heard that theory. Look, that was a conflict in which, the United States wound up like bowing out, and North Vietnam wound up taking over the entire country. We lost close to 60,000 like Americans, and tens and tens of thousands who came back with physical scars, deformities, post-traumatic stress disorder. I just don't see any silver lining for the United States in the Vietnam War. I don't see that it was sort of the United States flexing its muscles in a way and sacrificing 60,000 young people for a cause that was doomed probably from the beginning. It was an internal civil war, one can say, much like the American Revolution. So there was it's interesting that you're a political scientist, historian. There was a British statesman in the 18th century who spoke about the American Revolution, and he said something to the effect that a country is not governed which has to be perpetually conquered. And that one phrase sort of sums up why we were always going to win the American Revolution.
What does that mean? Can you say that again? That phrase, I didn't understand it.
So a country is not governed which is perpetually to be conquered. So
Still don't understand.
Okay, so I'll explain it.
I think I'm with you.
Huh? You understand? Good. So the only way that the British were ever going to be able to subdue the Americans was to be like a permanent occupying force.
Got it.
Okay, and they would have to always conquer the American, the American rebels, who are always going to be there. They may not be in the cities, they may be in the countryside.
Right.
Well,
it's an insurgency. It would be like trying to deal with an insurgency.
And it was an insurgency. So in the period like 1776, the British were holding like the major cities. They were in like Newark, they were in Trenton, they were in New Brunswick, and the Americans were fighting basically a guerrilla warfare, like picking them off when they would come out. There are a lot of similarities between the American Revolution and Vietnam. And in fact, Ho Chi Minh, who is the leader of North Vietnam, was following many of the tactics that George Washington had employed during the American Revolution. I didn't realize we were going to have a discussion on history, but I'm really fascinated by engaging in it.
I saw that, Justice. You're a huge student of history, right?
Yes.
Voracious reader.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, it's funny. Our first guest was a Navy SEAL, and he served with David Goggins. If you've ever heard of him, he's kind of a pretty famous Navy SEAL these days. And we talked with that first guest, the Navy SEAL, about, and it's funny you mentioned World War II. You said, was it your father who had served?
My father served, and like every friend who I had a parent who served either in the Pacific theater or the European theater.
And you mentioned the kind of state of the country after that. Patriotism was so high, and the tide shifts. I know I'm kind of skimming over a couple little skirmishes, but then you get to Vietnam, and the tide has, it seems like, shifted back the other way, where you talk about so many young people affected. And even to today, I think I have an uncle who served in Vietnam who was very, very affected by it in a number of ways. And we kind of talked about how that it seems like there was this shift where World War II, you serve, you're so celebrated. And then Vietnam, there seemed to become this, what are we doing here? And a lot of that I think is kind of continued to today.
Distrust in government, distrust in our leaders. When I was in grade school, I knew by heart the Navy song, the Marine song, the Army song. We sang those. So, I mean, the level of patriotism in the 1950s into the early 60s was really at a high watermark. And then the shift from, Vietnam, initially, the country was in, and then deceptions by the government, which were uncovered by journalists, and the incredible death toll on a weekly basis. So if you watch the news during those days, like Walter Cronkite, like once a week would be telling you like what the death tally was.
Yeah. It's first televised war, is that correct? That Vietnam, not necessarily televised, but Americans now have access to television, so they're getting those updates, whereas otherwise it might not have been the same way. And when you talked about Nixon, Kennedy, I think about as well that debate being televised and that being such a big factor. People who listened on the radio thought, hey, Nixon won, he did great. People who watched on TV, I think Nixon was sweaty, he, makeup running and things, and there's Kennedy all composed, and people who watched on TV said, oh, Kennedy, he's our guy. And this is the last thing before I'll turn it back over. But obviously, as an American, I've seen that Kennedy clip of, not ask what you can do for your country, ask what your country can do for you so many times. But to actually now be sitting with someone who has had the public service career that you have, who was so impacted by that clip that, I see and think, wow, that's a great speech. To see someone that's actually taken that and done so much with it is really, really, it's amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I was inspired by that, and also by the injustices that I believed were occurring in the South during the civil rights movement. So obviously, Martin Luther King was a prominent figure for whom I had like tremendous respect. And at that time, what was going on in the South was really like appalling to me, even as like a very young person. And I had this, sense of wanting to like fight or repel injustice from a fairly young age.
That's great. Yeah.
One thought I had when we were talking about the Revolutionary War, there's so much history in New Jersey. And when I was reading those, you have Carteret and you have Rahway. And I'm like, they're just names, I just thought Rahway's that town and Carteret's that town in Central Jersey. But then when I read the original writings around the Revolutionary War, Carteret was an American general. Rahway was another leader in this, and it's amazing, all the history. But let me throw something out, because we're going. You said we didn't. You didn't know we were going to go into history and stuff.
But that's fine.
Yeah, I didn't either. I didn't either because we don't have a script here. But you talk about Vietnam, and we lost 58,000 Americans, and so much more untold injury and blood and treasure from that war. And you're saying that you disagree with my one of my political science professors at Villanova that talked at least about a sort of strategic or global silver lining to that, which you disagree with. What about the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? You have any thoughts on that? Because you know the justification for that. You know what the justification was when Truman and they all decided and thought about that. What was the justification for that horror?
Well, of course, yeah.
What was it?
We were planning an invasion of Japan.
Exactly.
We would have lost like tens of thousands of Americans.
I think they were estimating millions. They were estimating 1 million soldiers we would have lost if we invaded.
And plus, there would have been equal to a much greater number of Japanese who would have been killed. So the prolonging of the war would have caused an immense number of casualties for Americans. But remember, the atomic bombs that were exploded over Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed tens of thousands of innocent civilians. So did the fire bombings of Tokyo. So one of the commanding generals for the United States said, if we don't win this war, we're going to be war criminals because of the result of the number of civilian casualties that were.
Yeah, I read in one history book that when they were doing the island hopping in the Pacific, and they'd be a little tiny island, and it would take them 2 months. I'm not even talking. What was the island with the flag?
Iwo Jima.
Not Iwo Jima.
Okinawa.
Yeah, but even the smaller ones.
Saipan.
Yes. And how those soldiers would fight to the death, and then any Japanese civilians that were on there would jump off the cliff rather than surrender. And they said, geez, if this is what it's taking for this little island, what's it going to take to attack mainland Japan? And that was, I think, a lot of the thinking that I read, at least in history books, about that.
I've heard stories as well that there were, guys hiding out in the jungle for Japan, and they would drop, leaflets that said, hey, the war is over, we surrendered, and they thought it was fake propaganda. So there was one island in particular, and I'm going to get my dates wrong. I don't remember if it was into the 1980s or it was decades after, that this guy was ransacking villages. He was hiding out in the jungle thinking that the war was still going on because it was such a, no surrender mentality.
Yeah, that's true. That was on an island. And the last Japanese soldier to surrender was like 1979 or 1980 or something, and they actually had to bring in a former Japanese military commander to formally take his surrender because he wouldn't surrender.
Yeah. So look, if Emperor Hirohito did not go on radio and call for the cessation of hostilities, the war could have gone on for maybe even years.
Yeah.
So what was amazing, given the level of fanaticism of the Japanese army, was that after those two bombings and Hirohito's calling on the army and the populace to surrender, that there was really obeisance to that command, and MacArthur was actually able to land in Japan with not a great number of people and not be killed.
Yeah.
So it was a difficult period in American history. People will continue to judge whether or not Truman's decision to drop the bombs was correct, whether or not he should have waited a couple more days after the Hiroshima bombing so that the Japanese public could get a sense of the horrific toll that the first one, before dropping the second one several days later. We'll be debating that for the next couple 100 years.
You ever see did you ever watch growing up or whatever? Did you ever watch I remember Channel 13. We used to love. Do you remember Channel 13?
Sure.
PBS.
Yeah. I used to love Channel 13, and we would all get excited to watch the nature shows on Channel 13. And I remember Diane Fossey, or they used to the gorillas. Remember the lady with the gorillas?
Yes.
and the whole thing. And then, did you ever see the shows where the gorillas are just at war, and do you know, or it's is it not gorillas? It's the chimpanzees in the jungle. They'll actually have different tribes, and they'll actually go to war with each other. Have you ever seen that or heard about that?
I haven't seen that one, but I'm not surprised by what you're telling me.
They will have organized warfare between one tribe of chimpanzees, and they'll go after each other. And when we talk about the evolution of man, it just reminds me of just how brutal, war and all that is. Do you ever hear St. Thomas Aquinas? In my Catholic tradition, St. Thomas Aquinas has St. Thomas Aquinas' just war theory. So I guess that kind of comes into talking about, was it a just war and all that, and talking about the, dropping the bomb, so to speak.
What's amazing is mankind can figure out so many different ways to justify killing.
Yeah, that's what's terrible.
Yes. Because you're a member of a different tribe, a member of a different race, a member of different religion, a member of a different nation. So all these justifications over the course of human history to gin up human conflict and wars.
When you're trying to train a 16-year-old kid or a 17-year-old kid or an 18-year-old kid to kill, you have to dehumanize the other side, so they come up with sort of racist names for the other side, and the German, the Krauts, whatever, to justify it. But World War I. Do you know it ended on the 11th month, on the 11th day, the 11th year? Do you know why that was, and if that was that random, or do you know the story behind that? When we talk about the guerrillas and how cruel man is? Do you know how that relates to that?
I don't think that ending the First World War on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month was a coincidence. I think they picked it. They knew precisely what they were doing when they called an armistice for that day.
Now, they knew. This is like we have let's say we have a personal injury case and we're settling the case. Okay, we're settled today. Today's Friday, but we're not going to tell the court until Wednesday, right? So that's kind of like what happened with the World War I, is they settled it one day. They're saying, all right, we're done, this is over, but we're not going to tell anyone because we just want it to happen to be on the 11th month, the 11th hour, 11th day. So Mark, what do you think the consequence of that was? Not telling anyone the war's over. That
there were still people dying and fighting before they actually formally ended the war.
Exactly. So when you talk about the craziness and the cruelty, tens of thousands of people continued dying just so that they could say that.
So what was the justification? What was the idea for 11/11? Why they picked that?
My recollection from political science class was just to make it 11/11/11 for whatever that means.
For whatever this means, it was a double jeopardy question last night. Is at Arlington Cemetery, I guess 11 a.m. is when they start to have viewings or ceremonies. So I guess that 11 is a very significant number. For whatever reason that may be.
So Arlington Cemetery is a former Robert E. Lee estate. I don't know if you're familiar with that. They purposely decided to make that the national cemetery.
Wow.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Basically appropriate his property and start burying American soldiers there. I don't know if you're aware of that.
I did not know that.
I did not know that. But so there is a method to this madness that we're talking about here. This is a long way of going back to the question of our times, in your experience talking about 1968 and the conflicts then, we were comparing it to what we're going on today and kind of going through some of these historical horrors. Things ain't that bad today.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I think things are pretty bad today, but it's not necessarily atypical of different periods in American history. We're talking about the early period of the Republic when we had the Federalists, okay, and we had the Republicans, the Jeffersonians, and they had partisan newspapers, and politics was a blood sport. It was really, really nasty. So we can find antecedents in American history, where politics was very, very brutish. I don't think we should be celebrating our current times because there is a sharp divide in the country. And when you look at the map, look at the East Coast and the West Coast, and you're looking at the center. And maybe this is not different from the early part of the Republic, but the Republican parties and Democratic parties have basically purged the moderate elements.
Big time.
And they're now at extremes. Now, one benefit of that is that people have a choice. Each party stands for different principles and different visions of the future. If you go back to the 1960s, you had arch conservative Republicans, and then you had liberal Republicans. We had a liberal Republican senator, Clifford Case, in the 1960s, called basically a Rockefeller Republican, and the Democratic Party also had really arch conservatives and liberals. So the politics of the 60s, at least with respect to the parties, is much different. And you see, for instance, the Republican Party, people who currently are of a more moderate tilt or have been driven out.
Yeah, and Jared, kind of to your point, I think it's kind of a perception versus reality thing. I think the reality probably is, you're right, that things have been worse. There's been bloodshed over these strong divides. But I think the perception of kind of where we are with politics these days, and I know we said we get flagged if we talk about politics.
I
but
think we're way beyond that at this point. But anyway.
It's tough not to. But I think the perception, especially too, with everyone being able to talk to each other more so, for better or for worse these days, I think the perception is that there's such a divide. And something that I believe it was Chris Placatello brought up, his kind of theory on this is that they stopped mandating that senators, that Congress needs to live in Washington, D.C. to serve. So everybody will fly out and then fly back in and vote. And so it's easy to be sitting in, say, Georgia and saying, oh, that senator from Maine is such an idiot. I disagree with everything he or she has to say. And you type that out on Twitter and then you go back to doing what you were doing. Whereas if you're in the same community, you're going to your kid's soccer game, you're running into the other senator there, it's a lot more difficult to be like, that guy stinks. I disagree with him so much that it's probably easier to find common ground just from a human nature perspective. So I thought that was an interesting take on it. I think there's a lot more that we could probably fill months of a podcast with talking about, but I thought that was an interesting kind of take.
It is an interesting perspective, but it didn't stop the American Civil War. They were all living in Washington together, not getting.
It's a great point.
Not getting along so well.
I like this. Jerry brought up something that you said, no, I disagree with that. I brought up something that you said, no, I disagree with that. That's why you've got so many strong dissenting opinions.
I'm trying to figure out why Charles Sumner was caned on the floor of the United States
Senate.
Good
point. It's funny.
But yeah, so you're telling us about where you went to school in the 60s, and you keep going through that story a little bit, if you don't mind.
I went to Rutgers College. I started in 1970.
How many kids in your family when you grew up?
I have two brothers. Both
brothers.
of them are dentists. One is retired. I sometimes kid around and saying, I came from a loving family, and I did, and two brothers who occasionally tormented me and then turned their natural talents to dentistry. But they really didn't torment me.
Did your parents go to college?
No. So neither one of so we were the first in our family to go to college. Both my folks were very, very bright and well read. My father mustered out of the Coast Guard in 1946 at the end of the Second World War, and wound up marrying my mother and then started to make a living. I think he regretted not going to college. He certainly could have. He was a very able student. And then he went into the profession that my family was in, and that was being a pressman. And so my grandfather, David, was sort of a union activist, a pressman, going back into the 1930s. And then my father, I think, just due to his natural ability and talent, wound up rising through the ranks and wound up shortly before his death actually running the press room for the New York Times.
And Justice, you followed in the family footsteps for a short period of time as well, right? Delivering papers.
So I was a paper boy, and the summer between the end of high school and college, I worked the graveyard shift at the New York Times, doing maintenance work. I was a news reporter. I was mopping, I was waxing and cleaning up. I started work at 10 o'clock at night and ended my shift at 6 in the morning. At that time, where I worked was a facility that just produced the Sunday New York Times. So they had the main facility was on 43rd Street. It's not really there anymore. That's where the presses would be rolling, and they had presses rolling on West End Avenue as well. I would get home at maybe 7:30 in the morning, and would be cleaning the ink out of my ears.
Wow.
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff in the atmosphere, and it was a really good experience for me because I was working with people of different color, different ethnic groups, working with African American 4-person Latinos who lived in the Harlem area, and I'm trying to think. I may have been the only white person on my crew.
Wow.
So yeah, it was a great experience for me.
So the reason I kind of touch on that is, part of the reason we've talked in past podcasts, I feel like part of the reason I'm even sitting here is I lifeguarded at a beach that Jerry went to, and he saw me sitting there lifeguarding for 8 hours, which isn't the toughest job in the world. But then after, I would go and cut lawns as well. My dad was in law enforcement, and rising up through the ranks, he would still do things on the side like cut lawns. So Jerry saw me cutting lawns, and he was like, wow, this kid's got a good work ethic. So it sounds like, Justice, from what you're telling me, that your work ethic kind of started to develop at a young age as well, because I know from obviously your career and the work you've done to get to where you are and to do the things you've done, it takes not just the intelligence you have, but a work ethic as well. You say that's fair?
Totally agree. And I really just started developing that work ethic in the academic area towards the latter part of high school. I would come home from school in Bayside and have my milk and cookies, go out and I'd play baseball and basketball. That was a routine. People might think, because of my service on the Supreme Court for 20 years, I'm like intellect, but back in those days, I had like a typical youthful experience and upbringing. So although I read a lot, I wasn't really fixed on excelling in academics. I was happy to be on the honor roll. I wasn't shooting for straight A's. It was only towards the latter part of high school I said, I've got to really go to college, and now I have to start concentrating on that. I'm not going to be a career baseball player. I figured that out at the age of 16. And through my efforts to really excel at baseball, I loved playing baseball. I played shortstop and third base. I was able to basically transfer this effort to excel at something which wasn't really going very far and turn it towards my academic pursuits.
Huh. That's awesome. And then you said you went to college at Rutgers?
So I went to Rutgers College between 1970 and 1973, and I knew that I wanted to go to law school. And I was working these summer jobs, didn't really like them, and I figured, why don't I it looks like I can get 120 credits in 3 years. So I hit with the absolute minimum number of credits, 120 credits. So I graduated in 3 years, and then I started Cornell Law School.
Wow.
So why, what brought you to law school? You talked about how the civil rights injustices kind of annoyed you and you wanted to do something about it. What brought you to law?
So I asked myself, what career where I can really make a difference? And I thought the legal profession was one. I had played around with, maybe being like a doctor, but I wasn't really good at the sciences. I'm sure I would have failed organic chemistry. I often, I would welcome people to the legal profession, to those of you who always dreamed of going to to law school and having a career in law, and to those of you who chose the law because you failed organic chemistry, welcome. Like many a person has turned to the law after flunking organic chemistry.
Did you ever, in grammar school or high school, if kids were being picked on, which, happened quite a bit, did you ever feel a sense to jump in or stick up for people, back at a young age like that? Did certainly stuff going on in the South that you read in the papers would annoy you, but how about, any actual situations where, little Jimmy's being picked on and you stick, anything like that kind of annoyed you back then that you can think of?
I was more concerned about looking after myself.
Yeah.
I'm not a person of big stature. So actually, I wanted to make certain no one was picking on me.
Yeah.
And therefore, I made certain that if there was going to be a fight, there was going to be one that would deter others from trying to get on my case. And that worked out pretty well for me. So I was thinking, in those days, I was thinking more along those lines. In grade school in Bayside, my classes were predominantly white. They were not really integrated. It wasn't until I went to junior high school and then later to high school where the classes were integrated. One of the things where I think I differed from many of the people who I grew up with, I never was interested in watching other people like fight. I wasn't like into that, and I didn't want to actually get into fights myself. But when I had to like draw a line in the sand, like to stop someone picking on me, then then I held my ground.
You did what you had to do. Yeah.
I did what I had to do, and that pretty much served me well.
So,
growing up.
Justice, moving from getting in fights in elementary school to we're covering a lot of topics.
Mark keeps us on track here.
Yeah.
Well, and again, I'm kind of doing the same thing as Jerry, things I'm just kind of genuinely curious about. So, kind of a boring question, but when you went to Rutgers, because I imagine if people are listening to this, they're similar to many of us in the room, and I won't speak for you, but I'm like Jerry, I can't do math. When they added in the X, the variable, that's when I bowed out. So I was a big history and English guy, and same deal. In college, I was English and political science. What were your majors? And
my major was history, but I took all sorts of courses because I actually was starting out pre-med. I wound up not changing my curriculum, even though as soon as I started, I knew I wanted to go to law school. So I actually kept calculus, and I kept French, and it was just through sheer hard work that I was able to really like ace those courses because I didn't have any particular facility in mathematics, but through sheer, I think, hard work and reading and trying to understand, I was able to actually do pretty well in those subjects too.
And you said you finished college in 3 years?
In 3 years.
Was there a program you did? You said it was like 120 credits that you could get by doing that?
That was the minimum number for graduating.
Okay.
So I was taking courses during the summer as well. I'd be working during the summer, and then I would take classes during the summer.
And just what was the motivation for that? Why were you trying to? Some people think about college, they want to kick back on the green, relax. What was your motivation for finishing in 3 years?
I knew that another 3 years awaited me.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to be done with it. I was like tired of taking exams. I loved college. I loved the courses, but the whole examination routine was not a thrilling thing for me.
I think you started to talk about too an externship or an internship you did that you liked that was a little different from what you'd been doing. Am I jumping ahead?
You're jumping ahead a little bit, but I think that might be good because it'll get me into one of the formative experiences that I had immediately before I became a lawyer. So I went to Cornell Law School, and my first legal job ever was in a prosecutor's office, and I was interning. So I was working in the appellate section of that prosecutor's office, and then I was assigned to assist the chief of homicide in the most sensational murder case of that year. And my job was to do legal research on eyewitness identification. There was a case called Neal versus Biggers that had recently come out that had set the standard. So during the course of my legal research, I'm also looking at the facts of the case. And when I'm looking at the facts of the case, I'm wondering whether or not there's sufficient evidence to even proceed with this prosecution. And at this point, I'm having pangs of conscience about, like, what am I doing?
Are you in law school at this point?
I'm in law school. This is
okay.
between my second year of law school and my third year of law school. And this entire case hinged on an eyewitness identification, which was really rather shaky. So I was debating with myself, like what do I do? I didn't go to law school to try to, become a collaborator in a miscarriage of justice. I want to use my time and efforts to accomplish good. So I actually wound up writing a letter to the chief of homicide and the head of the appellate section, like withdrawing from the case. And I said to myself, this is not like a very promising beginning.
Yes, an intern.
Career. Yeah, I am not even a lawyer yet. I'm about to completely like submarine my career. And then I decided that I was going to speak directly to the chief of homicide. I was told not to do that, but I decided anyway. So I confronted him with the facts of the case and my concerns about it. And I asked him, like, how can you proceed on a case where the evidence is so thin? And then he had given me this pat response that the case had been presented to a grand jury. The grand jury had found probable cause. And it was his responsibility now to present the case to the jury. Now, he was a super skilled, like, trial attorney. And when he went in trying the case, it was like full bore, full throttle. He wasn't holding anything back. And if you're proceeding with the trial, that's the way you handle it. Now, the family...
Well, not necessarily as a prosecutor, though. What's the rule for our rule as plaintiffs' lawyers is we are required to win the case, zealous advocates, to win the case and to try to get compensation for our clients. What's the difference for a prosecutor in that?
Well, a prosecutor should only be pursuing justice.
Exactly.
But he thought, at least as he conveyed it to me, that he was actually like doing that. So here's another thing I want to point out about this case, is that the family of the victim was very wealthy and very prominent. And like in retrospect, I wasn't thinking of that in the moment, that I think had a role to play in the ultimate prosecutorial decision. So I sat through the entire trial, and I won't go through all the details, but the defendant was acquitted of the case.
You sat through the trial as like, were you working on it or just observing in the back?
At that point, I was basically observing. I got to know the father of the victim, who was a young woman, had gotten to a spat in her family home and had left it and had gone down into the village area of this town. And she was last seen getting in a car, supposedly with a person who later became the defendant in the case. And there was only one person who saw those events, but she also saw a police officer nearby, and that became really key in the case because the police officer was supposedly at not far from that scene where she got into the car was actually in a rehab clinic. Okay, he couldn't have been there, and that was the insuperable barrier to the prosecutor actually being able to prove the case, and totally undermined the potential identification.
So the whole case hinged on this essentially one eyewitness?
Yes.
Wow.
So after I felt relieved from the acquittal, and then I pledged to myself if I ever became a prosecutor, I would never try a case where I had my own personal doubts as to the guilt of a person. If I had my own doubts as to whether or not the case could be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, I would never try the case. And it would make a difference if someone ordered me to do it, that would be it. Because I realized that my own ethical bearing, my conscience just wouldn't allow me to do it. It was this internal construction within me. And I didn't want to spend my time attempting to achieve a goal that was going to undermine the justice, our system of justice. I wanted to make certain that I was using my time and talents to achieve something good. That's why I went to law school. And so from that experience, that was my state of mind. And I stuck to that for all the years afterwards.
Judge, I came across actually even in a recent interview that you did where you talk about that case, that experience, and I think a quote you gave where you say, "Our system of justice is fragile. Even in the best of circumstances, there will be mistakes because it is a human system, but we must do our best to minimize mistakes by not pressing those cases that are on the edge." That's essentially what you just said today.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's something you took with you, not just through your career ultimately as a prosecutor, but then in private practice and as a justice on the Supreme Court.
Absolutely, right down to my last term
Yeah.
on the court. So I could actually say from that experience to my last term on the court, I literally went full circle. Because in my last term on the court, there was a case.
Ways?
Well, Ways was in 2003.
Way.
We can talk about that one. But I was
Okay.
actually thinking of the Michelle Ludzinski, because it was the only case in my 20 years on the court where the issue before us was whether or not there was sufficient evidence to support a finding of murder. And ultimately, it's a very complicated case, and it's a very sensational case. I wrote the majority opinion saying that it is very rare for a judge or for a court to overthrow a jury conviction because of the lack of sufficiency of evidence, but there is a residuum of discretion and power reserved to judges to ensure that a miscarriage of justice doesn't occur. And I wound up writing the opinion that overturned that conviction. And although I wasn't, thinking of that first commitment I had made to myself as like a 23-year-old law student, afterwards, when I was looking back, I saw it basically as a fulfillment of that original commitment I had made to myself.
For some of the maybe kids watching this, people that are considering law school, or maybe if they're in law school or lawyers now and trying to think about a career and where to go. I remember when I was doing insurance defense work, the boss would drop a file on your desk and go defend the case. And I didn't have the liberty or luxury of reviewing that file and saying, I think the defendant's wrong here, so I think we should pay like necessary. They're going to say, nope, go defend the case. How is that in the prosecutor's office? Like you as a 23-year-old, intern or clerk, are assistant prosecutors allowed to say, look, I don't think there's enough evidence here, or this, I'm not buying this one, either give it to someone else, or let's dismiss the indictment? How does that work as a practical matter for people?
Well,
At least
if
when
you're in
you
the
were there.
prosecutor's office, there are discussions. You have a lot of discretionary authority, and prosecutors should be exercising in a way that is going to advance the goals of justice, not to undermine them. Cases where there isn't sufficient probable cause should not be presented to the grand jury. This is going back to the quote. This is a fragile system of justice. We have failing memories, and we have misidentifications. We have false confessions. There are all of these things that can confound the ultimate goal of getting to a just result. Now, for the line prosecutor, you're a line prosecutor. When you're given a file, and if you're in the trial section, and the grand jury if there's a grand jury section, and there's been an indictment, you're given the file, and you try the case, and that's the way it's done. So, and that's the way I did it, except, and I can think of like one example where I was given a case, and it was a vehicular homicide case. Now I'm in the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office. We're advancing a couple of years from my
We're good.
internship. And the question was whether or not this person had blown past a stop sign purposely or like negligently. If it's purposely, it's a busy intersection, then that is reckless manslaughter. You're taking a substantial and unjustifiable risk by intentionally going through a stop sign. You're going to hit and kill someone. But during the course of my investigation, I'm preparing for this trial, I couldn't tell whether or not the person was daydreaming or intentionally blew through it, because the speed wasn't such that necessarily suggested intentionality. And then I was recalling that when I was going to Rutgers College as a commuter, that I would be daydreaming from time to time, and I'd gone through like stop signs. So I was putting my own personal experience to the test
Yeah.
here. And then I was persuaded that I couldn't determine whether or not the person had consciously gone through that or had just daydreamed. And then I decided, I'm not trying this case. But then I had to go to the prosecutor and tell him that I wasn't. I didn't know how he would respond. But at that point, it would have made no difference. Once I had made that decision, there was no way that I would ever try the case. So I did go into the prosecutor. He respected me, and he respected my decision, and that was it. I didn't try the case. I don't think that's typical in a prosecutor's office. So once I made that type of decision, then I was prepared to pay the consequences, whatever those consequences might be.
I think, and so did they ultimately assign it to another prosecutor, or did they? Would they dismiss it?
So I never really, followed up because I wound up joining the Willentz firm shortly thereafter. So it definitely was not dismissed out of hand.
Yeah.
But this is one of those cases where you're really pressing the system of justice to its outermost limits, and they're going to be in the best system of justice. There will be errors. Innocent people will be convicted. We cannot prevent that, but there are ways of minimizing it.
These stories are fascinating because when I was looking up, kind of going through, first of all, you're incredibly hard to research because there's so much stuff out there. You've written, so everyone knows, you only served as a on the Supreme Court. You were never on appellate division or the trial courts. Okay, so as a Supreme Court justice, I think the stats are that you've written 400 opinions. I think it's something like
230 majority opinions, over 130 dissenting opinions.
Yeah,
and then concurring
as well.
opinions.
Yep.
So I got 240 majority opinions, and just so people know, I guess the New Jersey Supreme Court has 9 slots. Seven slots. Okay, and so it's majority, so it's 4-3, and so a majority opinion is the opinion that is written on behalf of the justices that, and then if some of the justices disagree, they can issue a dissenting opinion just for the people that, do it. And you've written 400. That's a lot. That's a lot of law.
Yeah, big time.
During the 20 years I served on the court, I wrote more opinions than anyone. And that was a number of dissents and concurring opinions that I was writing. So an equal number of majority opinions is distributed to the members of the court, but you get no credit for dissenting opinion. You want to write a dissenting opinion? Go ahead, concurring.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why I'd be writing into the summer. I'd be writing into July and even August.
But what's fascinating is, so when I was researching a lot of those cases, and like I said, it's hard to do because there's so many and it's a lot of material, these stories that you're telling about your upbringing, about working late at the press factory and having the ink in your ears, and challenging your bosses on the viability or the legitimacy of a prosecution. It's shown in these different opinions that you've done, and these different, the biggest, I wouldn't, from looking at your history and looking at your material, you're not necessarily someone that goes with the grain. There's a streak of going against the grain there, and I think one of the most opinions that jumps out to me is the Lewis versus Harris, which is a 2006 opinion that dealt with gay marriage. And we talked about this a little bit a couple days ago, but back in 2006, that wasn't a common thing. For same-sex marriages, it was, in many ways, it was still taboo. People were in the closet, and that was a groundbreaking opinion. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, or about what your thinking was in that, as much as you're allowed to or can?
Sure. So at the time, in 2006, there were just several states that either recognized gay marriage or civil union and total equality of rights for committed same-sex couples. So in 2004, the Massachusetts Supreme Court, by a vote of 4-3, had voted that under the Massachusetts Constitution, gay couples had a right to marry. That was a fundamental right under the Massachusetts Constitution. And then there were a couple of other states that had recognized the same rights, but under a rubric of civil union. So I believe New Hampshire and Vermont and maybe Connecticut and no other state to my knowledge. After I want to set up 2006 by going back to 2004, the Massachusetts Supreme Court case. The reaction to that case was really strident in many other states in the country.
What do you mean strident? People were against. They couldn't believe it. What is happening to
They
America?
wanted to make certain that Massachusetts wasn't going to be infecting their states, and therefore a number of states passed constitutional amendments, state constitutional amendments, indicating that the union of a man and a woman was the only recognizable marriage. They wanted to prevent courts from getting into the fray. So there may have been like 20 states or however many states that passed those amendments. So that's like leading up to 2006. When the case came before the New Jersey Supreme Court, it was argued from two ends. One was under our state constitution, gay marriage is a fundamental right. And the state was saying that's like nowhere to be found in our state constitution. It can't be found in the history, traditions, or the conscience of the people, which is known as the Glucksberg test, determining whether or not you can find a fundamental right. So there were those like two extremes. And after the argument, I was actually taking a moderating approach because I wanted our court to be all together on this. And I was a fairly new member of the court because it was argued in like early, I guess, 2006. I wasn't even completely 4 years on the court at the time.
So were you not tenured yet, Justice?
I wasn't tenured. I was not tenured at that point because tenure occurs 7 years into your term of office.
I mean, again, it's another example of you putting your personal interests secondary to what you view as good for society and all that. Just like as a 23-year-old telling the boss prosecutor, this is a loser case, this is not a just case, and potentially putting your career path in jeopardy by making your boss mad or going against the grain. It's another similar theme here that you're not a tenured justice, which means it's not, the tenured means you could be fired essentially.
I want to be straight about
the
position I took as a 23-year-old. I did not put it all on the line. I confronted him with it. I was not really concerned that I was going to be fired as an intern.
Not fired, but
after
hey,
that,
this kid's a troublemaker. Don't you know? Like
they'd cut your $0 of pay in half.
Yeah, I wasn't really concerned. But going forward after that, I wanted to be clear what I would do and what I wouldn't do, what I was capable of doing, and what I thought was just beyond the lines of what I was willing to actually perform.
But I'm seeing that same theme in this the gay marriage case, and just to give people, because not only lawyers are listening to this. First of all, when you said you want all the justices to be on board, what does that mean? And
so there was a potential of a division of like a 4-3, an incredibly controversial case, and certainly there wasn't, I don't think, unanimity within the state at that moment. It was still evolving. The consciousness of the people were evolving. We're coming along. So my position was, we're at a stage where we should recognize that committed same-sex couples must be given all of the rights and privileges of straight couples. And that at this moment, that we should, at this moment, let the legislature decide like what name it could give to it. It could give to it marriage, that's fine. Give it civil union, and then we would see if they decide on a name other than marriage, whether or not the name itself made a difference. So that was my position. There were 3 members of the court who at that moment wanted to just recognize it by the name. And I was concerned.
You mean take it a step further?
Yes.
Okay,
So,
got
yeah,
it.
so I wasn't even at that extreme. Look, as a legislature, I would have voted for that. I
Yeah.
definitely believed it. But the question then for me was, like, what sort of reaction also would there be? Because you can try to achieve a goal and set it back by moving too fast. And I knew what the history was in a number of other states. I'm not saying it would have happened for sure in our state, but it's not difficult to amend the New Jersey Constitution. And I wanted to remove the civil rights of gays and committed gay couples towards that ultimate goal without triggering a reaction that actually could have set back that movement. So I wound up having 4 people with my position, and then Chief Justice Poritz wound up writing a really eloquent defense and saying that names matter. Okay, names carry importance. I think that's very true. But after the opinion was issued, there wasn't some like strong, like radical reaction. I was attacked by like both ends, quite frankly.
Well, then you did something right.
And I think it really helped move along this great civil rights movement and get people feeling comfortable. Like one of the lines, in my opinion, was that committed gays and gay couples, they're our like neighbors, they're our friends, they're our coworkers, they're our sisters and our brothers, and therefore, we have to ensure that they receive the rights to which they're entitled under our Constitution. One of the things I had pointed out in the opinion too is that there was something very strange at that time about under our law against discrimination, like protecting the rights of individual gays. Then, like, why would you protect them when they followed, the natural inclination of their sexual orientation and coupled? And that was actually the beginning of my opinion. And one of the other things I had pointed out in advancing this argument against the state is that the state was actually sending foster children to gay couples. Like, how could it be, arguing that they shouldn't have the same rights and privileges at the very time that they were sending children, and then the children would also be burdened by that stigma. So,
Justice, I give you I look back. I did my senior kind of capstone thesis on.
we're
Going to take a break soon. Yep, on Proposition 8 in California, which was I guess the bill to I didn't realize it was to outlaw same-sex marriage. It was a ballot initiative, and that was in 2008 that was coming up in California, which is typically thought of a pretty progressive, left-leaning state. And the fact that in New Jersey, I guess you had the courage to kind of recognize this issue and to issue the opinion that you did, I think really does. It speaks to what Jerry kind of highlighted on too. It may be unpopular, but it seems like you're following what you think is right, which I know as a lawyer, that's all we could ever expect or ask of a judge or a justice to do. So I think that's pretty.
Thank you. So I'll say
decision.
this before I know that we're gonna have a break. As far as I was concerned while I was on the court, like the core function of a judge or a justice was to protect like minority rights. The Bill of Rights is anti-majoritarian. Like who is going to protect those rights if not the judiciary? Right? Because so therefore, if you're actually following that credo, you're going to be doing things that are not necessarily going to be popular with the public. So this isn't if you're doing your job as a judge or a judge, this is not a popularity contest.
After the break, I want to ask you about the Dobbs decision in Roe v. Wade, because that's sort of like that same concept in many ways. To the extent we can talk about it, that's not popular. So I'd like to, when we come back, but we'll take a break.